Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. I haven't posted in a while because I've been, COVID eating. But my friend Elizabeth brought me a beautiful gift, and it made me think that many of us may be cooking very small Christmas dinners. So her gift of a lovely rack of lamb made me think this would make a beautiful, lovely, tasty Christmas dinner for two. So I thought I would prepare that and make a video in case you were looking for ideas for a smaller Christmas dinner that's very special. So here is a rack of lamb the way you would generally buy it in a grocery store. This is called a Frenched rack of lamb, and that refers to the cut. You'll see this has 8 bones, and generally you have 2 bones per chop. I'm going to use 1 stick of butter. I have here some minced garlic, sea salt. I have some paprika. From my garden, I have a couple of nice sprigs of rosemary. You can use dried rosemary if that's what you have. Now, when I cook lamb, I like to add a little brown sugar. We're going to make a compound butter, and I don't actually use sugar. This is Sucre Gold, which is what I'm using for brown sugar. Now, as I prepared the compound butter, I'm going to let this lamb come to room temperature. So my butter has set out to room temperature, gotten soft, and we're going to make a little compound butter here. A compound butter is just a butter with the spices and herbs added to it and mixed all through it. Many restaurants offer a compound butter with the bread. In this instance, I'm using it to prepare the meat for cooking. The butter is just a vehicle to hold the spices on the meat. So I've just added a teaspoonful of salt to this butter. That's normally more than you would use just for eating, but this is to hold it onto the meat, salt as a tenderizer. Then I'm adding half teaspoonful of paprika. The paprika brings a smoky flavor, and it also brings a color. You'll see when we're done, the meat is a little pinker than you would think it would be. Then I'm going to add a half teaspoonful of minced garlic. That would be 2 or 3 cloves if you're using fresh garlic. You could also use about a half a teaspoonful of garlic powder. Not garlic salt, garlic powder. If all you have is garlic salt, you'll cut down on the other salt. I find that I use this minced garlic in the jar almost exclusively now because dealing with the garlic cloves has gotten kind of hard from old hands. And I find this to be close to as good as fresh garlic. So now I'm just going to mix this up really well. And I don't know if you saw this, but I added a half teaspoonful of the brown sugar substitute. Then I'm going to add the rosemary from 1 sprig. I think my rosemary's gotten a little woody here. It didn't come off really easily, so I'm just pulling it off. It's December, and the only things still living in my herb garden are rosemary and sage, and I use a lot of those this time of year, so that's okay. Let me say a little bit about cooking with compound butters. I don't always make a butter to cook lamb. Sometimes I do it as a dry rub. The butter makes a little bit different texture on the outside of the meat, and it holds the herbs and spices where you want them. So I have that all mixed up, and I'm going to show you how I prepare my pan to cook the rack of lamb. I have a cast iron skillet here, and I have a cast iron trivet that I use in the bottom. And this works great if I'm just cooking 1 rack of lamb. If you'll see, I'm buttering it to keep the lamb from sticking to this trivet, and this will allow the fat to cook down underneath the trivet. If I were cooking more than one, I would use a regular roasting rack. So here I have the lamb. I've let it sit out on the counter while I was doing this other prep. Now I'm going to pat it dry with a paper towel. This is an important step. You don't want to have the juice on the lamb. And you want to do this when you're preparing to roast any meat. Too much moisture on the surface of the meat causes it to steam and prevents the heat from sealing the meat on the outside. Salt helps dry the surface of the meat as it cooks. That's one way salt helps tenderize the meat. If you don't dry the meat before you start roasting it, you can end up with dry meat when you're finished, dry inside. So now I'm going to spread the compound butter, being careful to cover the entire surface as uniformly as I can. So let's talk a little bit about doing this without a compound butter, because another method you can use is a dry rub. And I would just mix all of those spices and herbs together without the butter and then spread it uniformly on the meat. If you watch my videos a lot, then you know that I use a dry rub pretty often when roasting meat. The difference is using the compound butter gives you a softer exterior on the meat. If you use the dry rub method, you get more of a crust on the meat. So it's your preference. With lamb, I generally do a compound butter, not always. But this is going to give us a very soft and tender finished product. But if you prefer a more crusty, crispy exterior on the meat, use a dry rub. I have my oven preheating to 375 as I do this, so that I have a nice hot oven when I put it in. Just let me say a quick word about cooking lamb. I've probably watched a dozen videos on cooking lamb, and I've seen people make it seem very difficult. Lots of steps. Brown it in a pan and then put it in the oven and then take it out and baste it and brown it some more. And you know, lamb is a special tasting meat, and it is pretty expensive, but you really don't cook it very differently than you do pork or beef. You don't have to make it hard. This is going to be good just like this. I thought I would show you a different kind of rack. If I'm cooking 2 racks of lamb, which would be for 4 or 5 people, I use a little rack like this, set this down in a roaster, and put it in the oven. You can use any kind of rack, just something that will hold the meat up out of the fat. Now I'm going to put my other sprig of rosemary right across here in the oven at 375. I've set my timer for 45 minutes, and this is what I have. We're going to check this with a meat thermometer, and you want to insert it crosswise so that you're not up against a bone. And I want to cook this to about 145, and this is going to be, well, this should be medium, but it's actually medium rare. If you want this to well done, you're going to cook it for a whole hour. Now before you comment, let me say, if I cook this done, somebody would fuss at me for overcooking it, and if I cook it medium rare, somebody's going to fuss at me for it not being done enough. This is going to be about medium when I'm done. Don't waste the time fussing at me. Cook yours the way you like it. As with all roasted meat, I'm going to take this now and wrap it with aluminum foil. First, I'm going to let you listen to a little bit of that lovely sizzle. And I'm going to discard this cooked rosemary, but you'll see that there's plenty of rosemary all over the meat. So I wrap it tightly in the aluminum foil, and it'll cook another 5 degrees as it sits here while I make the sauce and get the plate ready. So now we're going to make use of this lovely rosemary garlic flavored fat that cooked off the lamb, mixed with some of the butter. And I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons full of flour. You want it to be equal parts. And we're going to brown that just a little bit. Not a whole lot. There's already some browning that's happened in the pan. Stir it up. And we're basically just making a gravy, but it's not going to be quite as thick as a gravy. So we're going to let that brown and get the flavor of the browning. And then I'm going to add a cup of beef broth. And if I had lamb broth, I would use that, but I don't. And I'm going to stir it well. And then I'm going to let that sit here and reduce so that it has just a little body to it. And just remember, we've got all that lovely rosemary and garlic flavor in there. And then we're going to slice up our lamb. Now you can slice this with either 2 bones per piece or 1 bone per piece. I'm going to slice this with 2. And you just cut down between the bones down to where it connects. Now, let me turn it around. You can see it better. Just run your knife through there, then you'll kind of go at an angle right there. And there you go. I figure 2 of this size per serving. This rack has 8 bones, so I'm going to figure that this rack serves 2 people a full meal. You know, I like lamb. You may want less. And now we're going to plate this up. I have back here some herbed potatoes that I canned this summer from the Ball All New Book of Canning and Preserving. So I'm going to put some potatoes right there on my plate. And then I'm going to put my chops on. And you'll see that nice pink. That's medium, as I said. If you want yours doner than that, cook them for the full hour. You want to go to about 165 degrees for well done. Now I'm going to drizzle some of this sauce, rosemary garlic sauce, over the chops and a little bit over my potatoes. Now I'm going to dress this plate up a little bit, and I'll have some things that I didn't go over how to make, but I'm going to put it in the info section. I have steamed asparagus, and I used a little of the compound butter, and I have a Greek vinegar, squash, red pepper, and olive salad with just a touch of Greek yogurt on top. To me, this is just a really special meal, and since we're celebrating differently this year, smaller groups, we may not want to cook a whole prime rib or a turkey or a ham. A rack of lamb may make a perfect Christmas dinner for 2. Not a lot of trouble, not hard to cook, but very, very special for your holiday. If you've never cooked lamb before, don't be intimidated by all the videos that you see and all the recipes you see that make it seem difficult. It's not difficult. It's wonderful. It's easy. I hope you give it a try, and I hope you love it as much as I love it. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.